Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much. John Whitaker was not just a veteran, he was a legend. As a young soldier in the 82nd Airborne Division during World War II, John's courage and tactical brilliance had earned him numerous accolades. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, he had led his men with unwavering determination, often placing himself in harm's way to protect his comrades. One of his most celebrated feats was during the Battle of the Bulge, where his unit had been outnumbered and surrounded by enemy forces. John's leadership turned what seemed like certain defeat into a daring counteroffensive, buying critical time for reinforcements to arrive. His actions earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, and his name became synonymous with valor. After the war, John's discipline carried over into civilian life. Refusing to let age define him, he embraced a lifestyle that prioritized health and strength. Every morning began with a brisk walk, followed by light calisthenics and stretching exercises. His diet was simple but nutritious: lean meats, fresh vegetables, and plenty of water. A strong body keeps the mind sharp, he often told younger veterans who sought his advice. And it showed. At 88, John's posture was straighter and his step lighter than many men decades younger. His physical vigor, combined with his quick wit and encyclopedic knowledge of history, made him a respected figure in the community. But John was not one to boast about his past. To him, the medals in his drawer and the stories he rarely shared were not about personal glory, but reminders of a generation's collective sacrifice. He spent his time volunteering at the local VA hospital, mentoring young veterans, and occasionally visiting schools to educate children about the realities of war. Despite his humility, there was an undeniable air of dignity about John. When he walked into Miller's Diner every morning, the locals greeted him with warm respect, knowing they were in the presence of someone who had truly lived for others. Yet for all his achievements, John had begun to notice a troubling shift in the world around him. The values of hard work, respect, and gratitude that had defined his generation seemed to be fading. More and more, he encountered young people who dismissed history as irrelevant, viewing the past as a burden rather than a foundation. It was a thought that weighed on him as he drove to the diner one sunny morning, unaware that the quiet sanctuary he cherished would soon become the stage for a clash of values, one that would test not only his strength, but also the enduring spirit of the generation he represented. The sun rose lazily over the small town of Brookdale, its golden rays filtering through the sycamore trees lining the quiet streets. John Whitaker eased his well-worn Chevy truck into the gravel lot of Miller's Diner, his favorite morning retreat. The diner stood as a relic of simpler times, its neon sign flickering with age, and its red vinyl booths welcoming locals and travelers alike. John stepped out of the truck, adjusting his cap emblazoned with a faded insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division. The years had bent his back and slowed his gait, but his piercing blue eyes retained the sharpness of a soldier who had seen the world at its worst and fought to make it better. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him. "Morning, John," Sally, the diner's owner and waitress, called from behind the counter. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, but her smile always softened when she saw John. "Morning, Sally," John replied, his voice steady but warm. He took his usual seat by the window, the sunlight casting a gentle glow on his lined face. For John, these mornings were a sanctuary, a time to enjoy the small comforts of life. As he unfolded his newspaper, the rumble of engines shattered the peace. 5 motorcycles roared into the lot, their chrome gleaming under the morning sun. John glanced up, his expression unreadable. The riders dismounted, their boots crunching against the gravel, and strode toward the diner. They were young, brash, and loud, their leather jackets adorned with patches that flaunted rebellion rather than camaraderie. The door slammed open, and the diner's chatter died. The bikers entered like they owned the place, their laughter boisterous and grating. "Hey, old-timer," one of them jeered, eyeing John's cap. "What's that? Some kind of souvenir from your glory days?" John folded his newspaper deliberately, setting it down. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel their mockery. "It's a reminder," he said evenly, "of what sacrifice looks like." The leader of the group, a tall man with a shaved head and a cruel grin, leaned closer. Sacrifice? What did you give up, old man? Your bingo night? Laughter erupted, but Sally intervened, her voice sharp. That's enough. If you're here to eat, sit down and behave. The bikers ignored her, turning their attention back to John. One of them snatched his cap, tossing it onto the counter. Don't need this relic dirtying up the place, he sneered. John rose slowly, his movements deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath. Son, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the bikers momentarily, you have no idea what respect means, do you? The leader laughed, stepping closer. Respect? Respect is earned, old man, and I don't see anything worth respecting here. Sally's hand hovered over the phone, ready to call for help. The other patrons watched in uneasy silence as the tension thickened. John's gaze didn't waver. You're right, he said finally. Respect is earned, and sometimes it's taught. The leader smirked. You gonna teach us, Gramps? The tension in Miller's diner grew heavier with each passing moment. The bikers, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, grew bolder in their actions. The leader, a tall, heavily tattooed man named Rick, swaggered toward John's table, his lips curling into a sneer. So you're just going to sit there and pretend we're not here? Rick asked, his voice dripping with mockery. He reached out and knocked over John's coffee cup, spilling its contents across the table. The other bikers burst into laughter. John sighed, calmly reaching for a napkin to dab at the mess. You boys sure know how to make an impression, he said quietly, his tone steady, but edged with a warning. What's the matter, Grandpa? Another biker taunted. You forget how to stand up for yourself? Or are you too scared? The diners watched in uneasy silence, some glancing towards Sally, who stood frozen behind the counter, torn between calling the police and confronting the bikers herself. But John remained composed, his hands steady as he folded the napkin and set it aside. Respect, John began, his voice calm but firm, is something you give as much as you demand. You boys might want to think about that. Rick's grin widened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. You've got a lot of advice for someone who's outnumbered. Maybe it's time we teach you a little lesson in humility. He gestured to one of his cronies, who grabbed John's cap from the counter and tossed it onto the floor. There's your respect, old man, Rick said with a laugh. Pick it up, if you can. The room seemed to hold its breath. John's blue eyes met Rick's, unflinching and steady. Slowly he stood, his movements deliberate. The years may have slowed him, but his posture was straight, his presence commanding. He reached down, picked up his cap, and dusted it off. This cap, John said, holding it up, represents something you can't understand. Sacrifice, brotherhood, honor. It's not just fabric and thread. It's a symbol of everything your kind seems to have forgotten. Rick's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Big words, Grandpa. Let's see if you can back them up. He shoved John back into his seat, eliciting gasps from the onlookers. Sally's hand shot to the phone, but John raised a hand to stop her. No need, Sally, he said, his voice calm but resolute. This isn't over yet. Rick laughed, turning to his gang. You hear that, boys? Gramps thinks he's got something left in the tank. Maybe we should take this outside, give him a proper send-off. The other bikers cheered, their voices filling the small diner with an oppressive noise. John remained seated, his gaze fixed on Rick. If you want to settle this, John said, his voice cutting through the din, we'll do it here. But you should know, I've faced men far tougher than you in my day. And unlike you, they had something worth fighting for. The room fell silent again, the weight of John's words hanging in the air. Rick's grin faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But before he could respond, one of the bikers grabbed a ketchup bottle from a nearby table and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, red streaks dripping down like blood. Oops, the biker said with a laugh. Guess we're making a mess. The act of vandalism seemed to embolden the gang further. They began overturning chairs, knocking over salt shakers, and laughing at the chaos they were causing. Sally shouted for them to stop, but her voice was drowned out by their raucous laughter. Through it all, John remained composed, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. He saw the fear in the other patrons' faces, the anger in Sally's, and the smug satisfaction in Rick's. Finally, John spoke. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice low but commanding. "But you're going to regret disrespecting this place, these people, and me." Rick stepped forward, towering over John. "And what are you going to do about it, old man?" John didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone, dialing a number with practiced precision. "Hey, Pete," he said after a moment. "It's John. I'm going to need some backup." He ended the call and set the phone down, his eyes never leaving Rick's. "You boys want a lesson in respect? It's on its way." The air in Miller's diner hung heavy with tension. Rick and his gang continued their rampage, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences. Broken glass and spilled condiments littered the floor, a stark contrast to the pristine diner it had been just an hour earlier. But amid the chaos, John Whitaker sat steady, his gaze unwavering, his phone call finished. Outside, the sound of distant engines rumbled faintly. John leaned back in his chair, placing his cap carefully on the table. The bikers, now emboldened further by what they saw as inaction, began to mock him once more. "Who'd you call, Grandpa?" Rick sneered, leaning close enough for John to smell the acrid tang of his cigarettes. "Your bridge club? Gonna take a while for the rest of the bingo squad to show up, isn't it?" John's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, his calm demeanor only fueling Rick's irritation. "You'll see," he said simply, his tone unwavering. As the bikers' taunts faded into the background, John's mind drifted back to a different time and place. The scent of smoke and the deafening roar of artillery filled his senses. He was no longer in a diner. He was back in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge raging around him. "Whitaker, we're pinned down!" shouted Pete Reynolds, his closest comrade and a sharp tactician. "We've got to flank them before they box us in." John remembered every detail of that moment. The bitter cold biting through his uniform, the fear etched on the faces of the young soldiers under his command. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but John's voice had cut through the chaos. "Hold steady, men," he'd bellowed. "We've trained for this. Cover fire on my mark, and we'll take that ridge." What followed was a masterclass in leadership and courage. Under his command, the unit had broken through the enemy's defenses, securing a strategic point that turned the tide of the battle. For his actions that day, John had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, though he always said the real reward was bringing his men home. Back in the present, the faint sound of motorcycles grew louder, pulling John from his reverie. He allowed himself a small nod, knowing his call had been answered. The bikers' laughter stopped abruptly as the sound of multiple engines filled the air, growing louder by the second. Rick turned toward the diner's window, his smirk faltering as a convoy of motorcycles pulled into the gravel lot. These were no weekend hobbyists. The men dismounting their bikes wore the years on their faces and the pride of their service on their leather vests. Patches marked with military insignias and mottos adorned their gear, and their eyes burned with the same determination that had carried them through wars. Pete Reynolds, his posture still as sharp as it had been decades earlier, led the group. He was flanked by other veterans John had fought alongside in Europe and others he'd met in the years after. Each man carried himself with quiet authority, the kind forged in the crucible of battle. Pete pushed open the diner door, his gaze scanning the scene. His eyes landed on John, and he nodded. "You called, Hawk?" he asked, using John's wartime nickname. John stood, his posture steady. "Figured it was time to remind some folks about respect," he replied, his voice calm but firm. The bikers, once so cocky, now looked visibly uneasy. Rick's bravado flickered as he took in the hardened faces and disciplined movements of the veterans. "What's this, some kind of geriatric gang?" He scoffed, though the edge in his voice betrayed his nerves. Pete stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Rick's. "Son," he said, his tone low and measured, "you're standing in the presence of men who faced down enemies you couldn't begin to imagine. I suggest you think real hard about your next move." The room fell silent, the weight of Pete's words hanging heavy in the air. John stepped beside him, adjusting his cap. "You boys wanted a lesson in respect," he said. "Class is in session." The silence in the diner thickened as the veterans moved into position, their movements sharp and purposeful. The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension reached its peak. Pete Reynolds stepped forward, his eyes locked on Rick, who now fidgeted under the weight of the scrutiny. "You've disrespected this place," Pete began, his voice steady and cutting through the silence like a blade. "And you've disrespected him." He nodded toward John, who stood tall and resolute, his eyes glinting with the fire of a man who had faced far worse in his lifetime. Rick scoffed, trying to muster the bravado that had carried him this far. "What are you gonna do about it, huh? You think a bunch of old—" Before he could finish, the veterans moved, swift and synchronized and ye toward. They closed the circle around the bikers with a precision that spoke of years of training and camaraderie. Chairs scraped against the floor as the bikers instinctively stepped back, their expressions shifting from cocky to uneasy. Pete's voice cut through the growing unease. "You're looking at men who stormed beaches, parachuted into enemy territory, and held the line when the world was on fire. Do you really think you stand a chance against that?" The bikers faltered, their earlier confidence now replaced by visible fear. Rick's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but the veterans gave no ground. They moved with the discipline of a unit in battle, their every step purposeful. John took a step forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We fought for this country with everything we had, our strength, our youth, our lives, and we did it so future generations wouldn't have to." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the bikers. "Never did I think we'd have to fight again, not against enemies of the state, but against our own. A group of young men, too blind with arrogance to see the sacrifices that gave them their freedom." His words struck like a hammer, the weight of his statement hanging heavy in the air. One of the younger bikers stepped back, visibly shaken. "Rick," he muttered, "maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Rick snapped, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. He turned back to John, trying to summon a shred of defiance. "You can't scare us with your war stories, old man." John's lips twitched into a faint smile, but his eyes remained cold. "We're not here to scare you," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're here to teach you." Without warning, Pete and another veteran stepped forward, their movements swift and deliberate. They seized one of the overturned chairs, setting it upright with a loud crack. The sudden motion made the bikers flinch, and a murmur rippled through the room as the veterans closed in tighter, their presence commanding and unyielding. "You've got two choices," Pete said, his voice steady but hard. "You apologize, clean up this mess, and leave quietly. Or you find out what it means to face men who don't flinch in the face of death." The bikers looked at each other, their confidence crumbling under the weight of the veterans' collective authority. Rick, now visibly sweating, tried to hold onto his bravado. "Fine," he spat, his voice shaky. "We're leaving." "Not yet," John interjected, his tone firm and unyielding. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Rick's. "You owe this room an apology. You owe Sally an apology. And you owe every veteran here an apology." Rick hesitated, then muttered, "Sorry." "Louder," Pete commanded. "Say it like you mean it." Rick swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the veterans who stood around him like sentinels. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time. He turned to Sally, his voice strained. "Sorry for the mess." Satisfied, John nodded. "Now clean it up." The bikers scrambled to comply, their earlier arrogance replaced by quiet humiliation. They righted chairs, wiped tables, and swept the floor under the watchful eyes of the veterans. When they were finished, they shuffled toward the door, their heads low. As the last of them exited, John turned to the room, his voice carrying a final message. Respect isn't just a word, it's a way of life. It's earned through action and upheld through integrity. And if we forget that, we lose more than just civility, we lose who we are as a nation. The room erupted into applause, the tension finally breaking as the townspeople expressed their gratitude. John adjusted his cap, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips, as Pete clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You've still got it, Hawk," Pete said with a grin. John chuckled softly. "Some things you don't forget." The two men exchanged a look of mutual respect, the bond between them as strong as ever. Around them, the other veterans began to relax, their mission complete. But the lesson they had imparted would linger long after the bikers' departure, a reminder of the enduring power of respect, unity, and the sacrifices that had shaped their lives. The dust settled in the diner, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered. As the bikers left, their roaring engines fading into the distance, the room erupted in spontaneous applause. For a moment, it felt as if the veterans had not just restored order, but reignited a sense of community pride. "That was something," Sally said, her voice breaking the momentary silence. She approached John and the other veterans with a tray of coffee cups. "This one's on the house, gentlemen, and thank you." Pete Reynolds accepted a cup, tipping his head in acknowledgement. "It's what we do," he said simply, but his tone carried the weight of decades of service and sacrifice. John, still standing tall, surveyed the room. The younger patrons, who had initially shrunk back in fear of the bikers, now looked at the veterans with awe and newfound respect. "You see," John began, addressing them directly, "this isn't about glory or medals. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." One young man, no older than 20, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, I didn't realize. I mean, I've read about the war, but seeing you all stand together like that," he hesitated, then added, "Thank you for your service." John's stern expression softened into a faint smile. "It's not just about remembering us," he said. "It's about remembering what we fought for and carrying those values forward." Word of the confrontation spread quickly. By evening, Miller's Diner was the talk of Brookdale. Some called it a much-needed wake-up call. Others spoke of the veterans with reverence, retelling stories they'd heard from parents or grandparents who had served. At the town's Veterans Memorial Park, a small group gathered, inspired by the events at the diner. Candles were lit in honor of those who had served, and spontaneous speeches filled the air. One man, the son of a Vietnam veteran, stood before the crowd. "What happened today reminded me of my father's stories," he said. "These men didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for all of us. And we owe it to them to be better." Back at the diner, the veterans lingered, sharing quiet conversation over coffee. The adrenaline of the confrontation had subsided, replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction. Pete leaned back in his chair, a nostalgic smile on his face. "Hawk, you remember that time in Bastogne?" he asked. John chuckled softly. "How could I forget? You nearly froze solid before we even saw the enemy." The group erupted in laughter, the camaraderie of old friends lighting up the room. But as the laughter faded, John's expression grew serious. "Today reminded me of something," he said. "We didn't just fight for our country back then. We fought for the future, for a world where respect and honor meant something." Pete nodded. "And it's up to us to keep reminding people of that." As the evening wore on, John found himself speaking with the young man who had approached him earlier. They sat together at the counter, John's weathered hand resting on the young man's shoulder. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," John said, "but it's not enough to know what's right. You've got to live it, every day." The young man nodded solemnly. "I'll try, sir." "Don't just try," John said. "Do it. Respect isn't just a word. It's a way of life, and it's up to your generation to keep it alive." As the veterans finally left the diner, the stars overhead cast a gentle glow on the quiet streets of Brookdale. For John, it had been a day to remember, not just for the confrontation, but for the hope he saw in the next generation. The fight for respect, it seemed, was far from over. But with people like the young man he'd spoken to, John felt certain that the legacy of his generation would endure. "Let's go home, Pete," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "We've done our part for today." Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.